Hello, Bio 16. We are starting with Chapter 1 of our Anatomy and Physiology textbook for Bio 16. We're going to be focusing on the anatomy component, not so much the physiology, but every now and again we will be talking a bit about the physiology because we're going to be talking about not only what the items in the human body are, but a little bit how they work. So let's first start with what is the definition of the word anatomy? It's actually a Greek word, anatomy, and it means a cutting. Different dictionary definitions also talk about what anatomy is: the science of dealing with structure of animals and plants, the structure of an animal or a plant or any of its parts. Or number 3, dissection of all or part of an animal or plant in order to study its structure. But what do all these definitions have in common? The word structure. So structure is a key part of anatomy. So why is structure so important? All specific functions are performed by specific structures in the body. And this quote is taken by another textbook, the Martini textbook. And so structure is what determines the function of parts of the body. So this is how we link physiology, the study of the body's functions, with anatomy. So physiology and anatomy are linked because physiology is the study of the functions. The structures you learn about in anatomy and their function you learn much more in detail in physiology. So for example, the heart can't pump blood without the structures of the heart, which includes all the muscle cells, the chambers of the heart, the valves of the heart, which are made of connective tissue, the nervous system of the heart. All of these components are necessary for the heart to function. So it's true that at many, many levels of organization, you can look at anatomical structures, and we call these anatomical levels of organization. So let's look at anatomical levels at different scales. One is, say, for example, the scale of the human body right here. The human body can be pretty big. If you have an adult, it could be small for a child, but it's definitely viewed unaided by the human eye. If we look at organs, like the human heart, organs are quite a bit smaller. You get smaller like your fingertip, the width of the fingertip. That's maybe about 10 millimeters. If we start going smaller and smaller, though, you're getting into the realm of the microscopic world, all right? When we say microscopic, these are items that are very small. Some of these you can actually kind of see very, very large, let's say, protozoans with the unaided eye. A human oocyte you cannot see. A red blood cell, all right, you do see blood, I'll give you that, but you can't see individual red blood cells without at least a compound light microscope, which is what you'd probably be using in like a basic biology class. Bacteria and then cellular organelles, say for example like a mitochondria, much smaller. By the time you get down to the level of viruses, proteins, molecules, amino acids, atoms, you really need to have something called a transmission electron microscope to see those items. So basically what we have here is things that are very big and things that are very small. I'm sorry, my dog is barking. So we also call this the macro scale, and this is called the micro scale. So microscopic anatomy or microanatomy are the studies of things that are too small to see without a microscope. So we use a light microscope, which uses light and lenses to magnify items or images. Electron microscopes actually use electrons, right? Electrons are like basic electricity, and computers to make an image of very, very, very small objects. Microscopes, however, they do have limitations. Cytology itself, cyto means cell, is the study of cell structures. And histology, histo, actually means tissue. So you're looking at the study of tissues. Now, what are we going to be doing in this class? We are going to be doing quite a bit of tissue histology. We're going to be looking at slides of individual tissues so that you'll be able to identify tissues based on a section taken from a living structure. Cytology itself, sometimes we're going to be looking at this, studying cell structure. Things like the nervous system has very unique, complex cell shapes that are well defined and help you identify the tissue based on the shape of the cells. Most of what we do, however, is macroanatomy in this class, or gross anatomy. And what you're doing is looking at items and structures that are visible with the unaided eye. So you might or you might use a magnifying glass, but for the most part, we're going to be looking at surface anatomy. Surface anatomy we also call morphology, or general form of things. This is a field where you're looking at, or a subject where you're looking at basic superficial anatomical markings on an item. So surface anatomy would be something like looking at the bumps and the valleys on the surface of bones to allow you to identify the individual bone. We have regional anatomy. This looks at all the structures in a specific area, and it identifies also whether or not those structures are superficial or shallow, or deep, which is deep in the body. We also have systemic anatomy, and this is where you're looking at anatomy one organ system at a time. So basically, in this particular case, you'd be looking at like the nervous system. So this is gross anatomy in A. You're looking at large structures such as the brain, versus microscopic anatomy where you're looking at individual cells, the neurons. And actually this neuron, if you could look at that here, here's the actual axon, here's the soma, the cell body. And then the dendritic fields would be out here like this. Cute, huh? Little hair beast. It's not a hair beast. It's like a dendrite beast, really. Now, there are other types of anatomy that biologists study: developmental biology, or developmental anatomy, and comparative anatomy. Developmental anatomy is something that basic biologists and doctors and nurses and anatomists study, because all vertebrate animals start out with the same components in the developing embryo. So for example, we have a mouth, there's a heart that starts developing in the central part of the body, pharyngeal gill slits that become part of the respiratory system, pharyngeal gill slits right here. There's a notochord. The notochord is a really stiff rod, but it does not differentiate into the spinal cord. The spinal cord actually starts right here, the dorsal hollow nerve cord, which will become part of the brain and part of the spinal cord. There's usually a muscular tail end, which each one of these little V shapes or little chevron shapes, they're called somites, and those become different parts of the body, muscles, some bone. Here's an example right here. In the human embryo, somites, which differentiate into vertebra. So all of these different elements differentiate into all organs of vertebrates on the planet. So you can see the somites again right here in a salmon embryo, somites in a chicken embryo, which differentiate as vertebra here and here. You can also see how the respiratory system differentiates. Well, maybe not respiratory, my apologies. The digestive system differentiates, and how the brain and the nervous system differentiates. So what are we looking at here? Anatomy helps us do a number of things. We have medical anatomy that gives us information on how items change during disease or illness. Basically, structures as we age, all the structures in our body as we age change their shape, they change their abilities, the whole use it or lose it type thing. But as we age, medical anatomy changes. Medical anatomy can be looked at and studied using radiographic anatomy. So this is where you're looking at structures that you can, say, take an x-ray of or a sonogram of. You're looking at structures using non-invasive techniques. You're not cutting into the tissues to find them. Radiographic anatomy is really helpful when you're studying growth and development of children, or you're looking for broken items, say, for example, looking at a broken bone. We also have surgical anatomy. Surgical anatomy is the study of structures that were useful in surgical processes and procedures, such as landmarks, guideposts to other structures. Landmarks would be things like the midline, the umbilis, your belly button. These surgical anatomical features help a surgeon find the item that they're looking for by knowing where the landmark anatomical features are in the body. So we're going to move on now to levels of organization. Levels of organization are important because, as we looked at before, you can look at anatomy in the macro or large world, or the micro, the small world? Well, the body is organized at levels that are macro and micro as well. And we're going to start small. Cells are the basic unit of living material, the smallest unit of life. Cells can be organized into tissues. Now, tissues typically are made up of 2 or more cell types, all right? Organs are combinations of tissues, usually 2 or more tissue types. Organs combined to form organ systems, say, for example, cardiovascular system. And in the human body, there are 11 organ systems, and I have a cute trick for you to memorize all 11 organ systems and remember them for the exam. So if we look at the levels of structure and organization, this should say figure 1.3, not Figure 1.3, that's figure. I'll have to fix that. We start small up at the top here with atoms and the chemical level. We have molecules, and then we start at the cellular level. This is the dividing line between living and not living, okay? Or not alive. Atoms cannot be alive, but cells can. Tissues can, and they are. So organ systems all help maintain homeostasis, or a happy, healthy physiological level for humans and other animals too, but we're going to be paying attention to humans in this class. So for humans, homeostatic temperature is 37 degrees Celsius. Now remember, we're doing science here, so Celsius and metric measurements are what we're using in this course. The pH of human blood is about 7.4. It's slightly alkaline. Remember, pH of 7 is neutral. And concentrations of nutrients and other chemicals are kept at a relatively stable level, which is a homeostatic level, to keep the body happy and healthy and working properly. Most organ systems are always working to maintain body homeostasis. And when homeostasis is lost, and if it's not recovered quickly, that can result in some serious illness and even death. So let's say, for example, blood loss, hemorrhage, okay? If an individual has tremendous blood loss because of an injury, a hemorrhage, the heart can't pump efficiently, oxygen can't be carried to the brain and other parts of the body, and the individual very quickly loses consciousness and can die due to blood loss, which then means that there's no oxygen being delivered to the body. Now, organisms share 5 basic properties, okay? The organ systems try to help maintain 5 basic properties of living, of life. So you have responsiveness to the environment, which means there's an immediate response called irritability to changes in the environment. Irritability isn't just that you're mad. Irritability just means that the tissues or the system is responding to a change in the environment. Long-term changes, though, are called adaptation. So let's say, for example, you go to the gym and you lift real heavy weights and then you're sore the next day. Well, that's an immediate response. Your tissues are irritable, you're uncomfortable, you're sore. Over time, though, if you keep lifting 2, 3, 4 times a week, your body no longer gets sore lifting the same schedule. That is adaptation. The irritability goes away and it's replaced with a long-term adaptation. Growth and differentiation is part of development of organisms. Growth is a change in the number of cells and potentially the size of cells. So as we all grow, we add cells to increase our body size. Differentiation is the specialization of those cells. And so the specialization is what is really important, because the specialization of cells leads to the functioning of the tissue and those cells. And then there's reproduction. Reproduction, creating new generations of individuals, but I would like to add another point to that. Reproduction can also be for growth and repair. This is when you have cell reproduction. Now, cellular reproduction, what do we call that? Mitosis. Yay! We'll be reviewing that soon enough in another chapter. But creating new generations of individuals and mitosis, growth and repair of cellular tissues. are both considered reproduction. Sorry guys, I know my handwriting is not that great, and I'm trying to write upright on a tablet, doing my best. So all living organisms also move. So internally we have the transport of blood, we have the transport of nutrients and so forth from the external environment to the internal environment. We have metabolism and excretion. Metabolism are all the chemical reactions in your body. Now I know we think of metabolism as like how much energy we have or how much energy we expend. Metabolism, humans actually have a pretty high metabolism. And so I know for myself, my metabolism is roaring along. I wake up hungry in the morning, and my metabolism is boosted up every time I eat, right? If you get hungry, that means you have a good metabolism. Now, I know sometimes I kind of overdo it. Let's say, for example, on pastries. I love pastries. You'll notice in this class that I talk a lot about food. What can I say? It's my hobby. I like to eat. Food is wonderful. But if I overdo it, I saturate my metabolism with additional nutrients, and the additional nutrients are stored through chemical reactions, all right? Which means that I'll have to undergo more chemical reactions to get rid of that stored energy that I put on usually during Christmas, eating all those cookies. This is what we call anabolism and catabolism. Anabolism is not cannibalism. Anabolism is building. So for example, when I'm storing energy, let's be honest, fat and energy because I ate too many cookies at Christmas time, that's an anabolic process by which I am developing my adipose tissue, my fatty tissue. If on the other hand, I'm working out a lot, I can use up some of that fatty tissue. That's catabolism, breaking things down. But through catabolism, I can build muscle, which is anabolism. So anabolism builds, catabolism breaks down. And so you have this round and round and round, this circular process. Nutrients, though, have to be absorbed into the bloodstream or into cells before they become used. We'll talk about that later in the digestive system. Respiration is the absorption, transport, and use of oxygen. Oxygen goes on to make ATP in cells. We're not going to talk about that in great detail in this class, but you will if you in physiology if you haven't taken that class yet. And excretion is the removal of waste products from the circulatory system and also from the respiratory system. We do excrete CO2, or not excrete, but release it. And excretion of waste products like ammonia go out through our urinary system, through the kidneys. So now we're going to do a quick review of the 11 organ systems. These figures here from your book, figure 1.4, on this slide and the next are very small. So what I did was I put in some slides from another lecture that I had on the human organ system. However, figure 1.4 is going to review all 11 of them. And the way we remember the names of all the organ systems are using this little anagram, mind curlers, MINDCURLERS. Muscular, integumentary, nervous, digestive, mind. Circulatory, urinary, reproductive, lymphatic, endocrine, respiratory, and skeletal, curlers. So if you can write out mind curlers and then identify each word with the initial letter, you'll know all 11 systems of the human body. So again, I'm going to go step forward because these are really small. We're going to start with the muscular system. The muscular system consists of skeletal muscles. We're going to look at the axial muscles and the appendicular muscles. The axial muscles support basically the torso of the body, okay, and part of the neck. The appendicular muscles include the arm and the legs. Okay, so we'll be looking at that. Appendicular support, move, they brace your movement. Associated with muscles, now there's 700 muscles, you don't have to memorize them all. We'll get back to that when we talk about the muscular system. Associated with muscles are tendons and aponeuroses. These tendons and aponeuroses allow muscles to contract and perform their duties. We'll get to that in more detail when we get to the muscular system. The integumentary system is the largest system in our body. It consists of cutaneous membranes, skin, which are the epidermis and dermis, all right? The skin is actually a really cool organ. We'll be looking at that in detail pretty soon. Hair follicles, which include hairs and sebaceous glands, sweat glands, nails, sensory receptors that give us idea about pressure, touch, temperature, pain, to some degree, maybe chemicals, depending on the type of chemical. And then we have a subcutaneous layer. This is where lipids are stored, and this is what attaches our superficial layers of skin to deeper layers. So we'll get to that when we talk about the integumentary system. The nervous system is broken into two general areas: the central nervous system, which is the brain, the spinal cord, and the special senses. Special senses are things that kind of have, well, not kind of, but have an organ devoted to them. And that includes sight, or your eyes, hearing, your internal auditory system, and part of the external, smell, taste, and equilibrium. Equilibrium is associated with hearing because they're real close to each other in the skull. We'll get to that later. We also have, in addition to the central nervous system, the peripheral nervous system. This is what links other systems to the central nervous system, and the peripheral nervous system consists of all the nerves outside of the spinal cord. And I write SC for spinal cord. This is the peripheral nervous system. And yes, we're going to get to memorize a lot of those nerves' names. Digestive system, one of my favorite systems because it brings things into the mouth, which usually tastes good, but sometimes we get a surprise, which is not good. Basically, the mouth has associated glands, salivary glands, that link to the pharynx. The pharynx is the back of your mouth, or the back of your throat, basically, and it joins with the respiratory tract. So it's associated with your sinuses. Now, this is weird because right here where they drew this little kind of dot for pharynx, that's the back of your throat. It's not the chin, it's the back of the throat, okay? The esophagus delivers food to the stomach, and then the stomach itself secretes enzymes and acids and mucus so that we can start digesting our food. Now, digestion starts in the mouth with the secretion of enzymes via the salivary glands. We'll talk about that later. Stomach leads to the small intestine, which leads to the large intestine, which then exits the digestive system to the anus. Accessory organs would include liver, gallbladder, and pancreas, which we'll get to later. The cardiovascular system most people are very familiar with is our heart, blood vessels, and the blood itself. Now, the blood, we usually talk about that kind of by itself because blood does a few other jobs than just transporting oxygen and carbon dioxide and nutrients. Blood also helps maintain body temperature. It contributes to immunity. So we'll talk about that in kind of its own little world. Blood vessels, we have arteries, capillaries, and veins, which we'll talk about in detail. Their structure is really cool. They're like a bunch of hoses through the body. The urinary system is part of the excretory system. The urinary system consists of the kidneys, the ureters, the urinary bladder, and the urethra. The kidney is what filters circulating blood. The kidneys then secretes or excretes urine, which is stored at the urinary bladder, and relatively short tube, shorter in women than in men, connects the urinary bladder, which is called the urethra, and the urethra is the exit point of urine from the body. Now, the respiratory system allows air to enter the body for gas exchange and exit the body. The respiratory system starts with nasal cavities, paranasal sinuses way up here in the head, leads down through the pharynx, across the larynx, which allows us to vocalize. We have the trachea, which lead down to the bronchi, the lungs, and eventually the alveoli where gas exchange happens. The lymphatic system is a reflection of the circulatory system. If you look at where you find blood vessels, oftentimes you also find lymphatic vessels. Lymphatic vessels carry lymph. Lymph is basically fluid that escapes the circulatory system out into tissues. Really interesting system. Lymphatic vessels then lead to, to lymph nodes. There we go. My pencil's working again. The spleen and the thymus are also a part of the lymphatic system. I'm sorry if you hear my family talking. Yay, online learning. The endocrine system, oh man, this thing is huge. The endocrine system, what it does is secretes hormones that allows your body to carry out very important processes. The endocrine system, you're going to study this in a lot more detail in physiology, but let's just look at the organs. The pineal gland, which is in the brain. Oops, there goes my pencil again. The pineal gland, which helps time our day and night rhythms by secreting melatonin into our bloodstream so that we start feeling sleepy. It tells our brain, hey, it's nighttime. The pituitary gland, which basically governs fluid balance, basic growth, sexual differentiation. The pituitary does a lot of jobs. The thyroid controls metabolic rate. It also controls calcium levels. The thyroid contains, or sitting like right close to the thyroid, are the parathyroid glands, and calcitonin secretion helps regulate calcium levels in the body and in bones. The thymus itself produces lymphocytes. So the thymus is kind of it's not really a butterfly-shaped organ, it's a sac-shaped organ, which makes new T cells to help with immunity. The adrenal glands produce all kinds of fun regulatory hormones like, epinephrine, norepinephrine, which allows our respiratory and our cardiovascular system to operate under normal circumstances and in fight or flight. The kidneys regulate blood cell production, which is crazy, right? You think about red blood cells in your bones, but your kidneys telling your bones, hey, we need more red blood cells. And it also participates in blood pressure. So again, in physiology, you'll be talking about that much more. The pancreas helps regulate blood glucose level by secreting either insulin or glucagon. And then the reproductive system, which does involve reproduction of the species. The endocrine system component of the reproductive system are the testes and the ovaries. So in addition to performing reproductive functions, the ovaries and the testes make hormones, sex hormones, that help develop and support the secondary sexual characteristics of males and females. So here's the reproductive system, for example, first in males. We'll be looking at this in greater detail. The testes produce sperm and hormones. And then you have accessory organs like the epididymis, the ductus deferens, which also is called the vas deferens, seminal vesicles, the prostate, the urethra. That's all accessory internal organs. The external genitalia would include the penis and the scrotum, which is a part of not only controlling the temperature of the environment, but is also necessary for sexual reproduction and delivery of the sperm, right? In females, we have the ovaries, which produce, again, gametes, oocytes in this case, and sex hormones. The uterine tubes, the uterus, where the developing embryo grows and becomes an individual. The vagina, which is where sperm is deposited. The external genitalia, so those are all part of the internal reproductive system. The external genitalia includes the clitoris and the labia, and then the mammary glands are necessary for producing milk for the newborn offspring. And then the skeletal system, which is the last because it's mine curlers. The skeletal system, we are going to learn pretty much most of the bones, all the bones in the body. We are going to talk about the skull separately from the axial versus appendicular skeleton. They're highlighting the axial here in yellow, and the appendicular is supposed to be kind of in this greenish color. We'll get into much more detail on that later on. The skeletal system includes all the bones, cartilage, and joints. So we are going to talk about the joints. And then the bone marrow. The bone marrow is the site of red blood cell production, but there's also some white blood cell production that can happen there. So the last bit of information that we're going to focus on in this lecture are regions of the body. And these are basically anatomical terms that you need to know so that you can describe what is going on in the body or on the surface of the body anatomically. So for example, if you need to identify where a bone is broken, or if you found a cut, let's say on the back of the thigh, well, that would be associated with the femur. All right, so the human body here is shown in anatomical position. Anatomical position is with the human body facing you and the palms facing upwards. So this is the palm of the hand. So this would be the palma or palmar surface of the hand. So what do you need to know? Basically, we are going to, one of your assignments for this week is identifying the location of a scar on your body. And you're going to be using this figure 1.12, to identify the location by describing where the scar is using these terms. So if it's thoracic, I'll know it's in the front of your chest. If it's on the dorsum, I'll know that it's right here in this region of the back, all right? Not necessarily on the midline, but on the dorsal surface of the body. Cephalon or cephala is head. Oculus or ocular is eye. So study these words because this will be a part of the exam. Now, what am I going to do for the exam? I will give you a study guide on what to study so that you'll be ready for a test on this information for quiz 1 and also for your lab exam. Now, the directions of the body are also very important. Up near the top of the body is the superior, and the very bottom by our feet is inferior. The middle is medial, the sides are lateral. Proximal is closer to the center of the body, and distal is far away. So we have proximal and distal ends of all of our appendages. So proximal is going to be closer to the middle and distal is far away. Now, I guess you would say that my hand is closer to the middle than my shoulder. If you spread your arms out away from the body, you'll see that distal is farther away. The front is anterior. It can also be called ventral. We are going to be using anterior as our definition. And the back is posterior. Cranial is for the head. Caudal is down near the base of the spinal cord. So all of these terms are used to identify positions of the human body. Now, planes of body section are important because if you're ever reading an X-ray, you need to know what slice is that image taking of the body. So the frontal plane is slicing the body between anterior and posterior. This can also be called the coronal plane. The transverse plane is top and bottom through the belly button or through the middle. Now, you can still have a transverse section right here. You just have to identify where is it. Is it going to be near the umbilicus? Is it going to be cardiothoracic? All right, so you would be applying not only the transverse body plane, but you'd be identifying what cavity. This would be a transverse plane through the thoracic cavity, and this would be a transverse plane through the abdominal cavity. The sagittal plane cuts you in right and left sides. Okay, so this is right and left. You can have sagittal right here, or you can have sagittal right here. Now you can identify that I kind of have a tic-tac-toe grid set up on the human body. We'll get to that in a minute. Oops. All right, so I did it again with my figure label here. I'm going to need to pull that up front. So the body cavities that we're going to talk about have a little bit to do with this tic-tac-toe grid, although it's going to be more like this, but we'll get to that in a minute. The body cavities contain our organs. So basically, you look at the dorsal body cavity. Dorsal means your back, if you're laying on your belly. Think of a dog or a cat. We're bipedal, so we stand on 2 legs and we use our arms and our hands to do things in the environment. Dogs and cats stand on 4. Cows, quadrupedal animals all stand on 4. The back is always dorsal. Think of dorsal fin like a shark, right? There you go. Even though we don't have dorsal fins. Let me see if that'll erase. Nope, I'll have to figure that out. Oh, maybe it erases with this. Nope, sorry. Okay, so that's dorsal. And ventral is always the belly, okay? Or, if you look at the ventral portion of the body cavity, it'll be down here. So dorsal is going to be your back, which consists of the cranial cavity and the vertebral cavity. The vertebral cavity has within it the spinal cord. The ventral body cavity is going to contain the thoracic cavity, which is going to have your heart, the pericardial cavity, your lungs, the pleural cavities, and then you have the superior mediasternum, mediasternum, we'll get to that in a little bit. We also have the abdominal cavity, which is going to contain the not the reproductive, but the digestive system, part of the immune system, and then we have the pelvic cavity. This is where you find the reproductive system. So the ventral body cavity is basically the stuff on the front of your body. The dorsal body cavity is the stuff in your spine and including your brain case. The thoracic cavity is separated from the abdominal cavity by the diaphragm, which is a thick layer of muscle. And the abdominal cavity is separated from the pelvic cavity using mesentery, which we'll talk about later. Here's our tic-tac-toe. So the regions and the quadrants of the peritoneal cavity, or the internal body cavity, can be broken down into the abdominal pelvic regions or just abdominal pelvic quadrants. It kind of depends on what question you're asking as to whether or not you're talking about quadrants or regions. You do need to know both. There are 9 abdominal regions. Each region has a different set of organs. So we have the right hypochondrotic region, which contains pretty much liver. We have the epigastric region, which is going to contain liver, gallbladder, and stomach. The left hypochondrotic region contains stomach, some spleen maybe, pancreas. We have the right lumbar region, the umbilical region, which you'll find your belly button in, and the left lumbar region. And then you have the right iliac region, the hypogastric, and the left iliac. Each one of these regions are going to contain different organs down here in the right and the left iliac region, depending on whether or not the individual is male or female. That'll come later. When you're looking at the quadrants, the right upper quadrant, left upper quadrant, right lower quadrant, left lower quadrant, that's pretty easy to identify. Now, one of the quadrants that we pay special attention to is the cardiac, right? Let's come back here. Or I guess I should say cavity, not quadrant. The pericardial cavity within the mediasternum. So the heart is encased in basically a pericardial sac. The pericardial sac has an internal layer and an external layer, okay? The visceral pericardium is next to the actual heart. The parietal pericardium is next to other structures in the body, like the lung. And so the idea is that the heart is sitting inside of a sac, or kind of like a balloon, that envelops the heart and protects it. And one of the key reasons why this is a really good design is because there's a small amount of fluid inside of the pericardial cavity. That amount of fluid allows a smooth contraction and relaxation of the heart. And as the heart is contracting and moving, no friction builds up between the heart and the lungs. The heart and the lungs are very delicate tissues. You don't want friction building up there. What does friction do if you rub your hands together a lot? Well, your hands warm up. Look at your feet. If you have any calluses on your feet, those are areas where friction builds up and tissues thicken. That's not good for heart or lung. All right, that is the end of chapter 1. Let's close that out. And I will see you again in chapter 2.